Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mariam Hussein. I'm the current secretary of NIIMS. Just want to thank you all for joining us for our next installment of our monthly webinars about the history of Islam and medicine. Before we get started, or as getting started, I'd like to hand this over to our executive director, Sister Alia Herzallah, to start us off with a dua.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for attending. Inshallah, I'm going to read from Surah Al-Dariyat. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وفي الأرض آيات للمتقين. وفي أنفسكم أفلا تبصرون وفي السماء رزقكم وما توعدون فورب السماء والأرض إنه لحق مثل ما أنكم تنطقون. صدق الله العظيم. Thank you again for attending. Inshallah, it will be a great lecture. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you so much, Alia, for that beautiful recitation. And now we'll show a very short video about NIIMS.
Nagamia Institute of Islamic Medicine and Sciences, formerly known as the International Institute of Islamic Medicine, aims to bring alive discoveries and inventions in medicine and other sciences. Through exhibitions, storytelling, and modern technology. We are a network of academics, historians, scientists, and physicians with deep subject matter expertise. We are eager to share our knowledge to create experiences that produce a better understanding of the Islamic ethos and the contributions of Muslims to medicine and other sciences. We invite you to join us to promote a scientific mindset and to inspire excellence in generations to come.
All right, again, welcome everyone. Thank you again for joining this webinar with you all today. Before we get started with the presentations, we've been through a lot here at NIIMS these last few months. And so before the presentations, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tajuddin Ahmed. As you all very well may know, Dr. Ahmed has done a lot. He was a founding member of Imana back in 1967 in Columbus. I'm the president of Imana, so that's a special place in my heart there. He also helped Dr. Hussein Nagamia start NIIMS, and especially when it started off as IIIM, or the Institute of Islamic Medicine. As a cardiologist, he's obviously a very active community member. He's done so much, and so without further ado, Dr. Ahmed.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Wal asr. Innal insana lafi khusr. Illa allazina amanu wa amilus salihat. Wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Welcome to the monthly webinar. Today I'm very much grieved to report the founder, the visionary, the scholar for whom this institution was named, Dr. Nagamia, passed away. This was one of my most painful time ever in my life. to lose such a visionary, and I never realized that he left such a huge vacuum. It's impossible to replace him in any form or shape. So I'm struggling. I'm trying to make sure that his legacy is continued, and I'm very proud of the new leaders who have joined the NIIMS with a lot of their enthusiasm, energy, and plans to take this institute to a next level. So you will be hearing from me our new leaders as we move further. So enjoy the presentation today, and Mariam will moderate the session. Mariam, you're on.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. That was very sweet, very kind words for Dr. Nadamian. I know one thing that we all can agree on is that he was definitely a hard worker, and he would want the work to continue. And so without, with keeping that in mind, so I'd like to introduce everyone to this webinar on the contributions of the Islamic civilization and medicine with a special reference to urology. We have two amazing speakers here with us today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Mahmood Hai. If I give his bio, it might take the whole hour, so I'll just keep this very short too. So Dr. Hai was a senior urologist with Comprehensive Urology, a division of Michigan Healthcare Professionals. He is currently retired now from active practice, but has been very involved. He was president and executive director of the Surgical Institute of Michigan. He's a community activist and has been involved with several projects, including services to for the community and for the betterment of humanity, specifically, especially here at NIIMS as well. Our second speaker will be Dr. Muzammil Ahmed. He's a current urologist in the metro area in Detroit, in Michigan. He's the chief of medical staff at Beaumont Wayne Hospital, and he's a clinical assistant professor of urology at Wayne State as well. He's also on the executive board of Michigan Healthcare Professionals, like Dr. Hai was as well, and is the chairperson of Engage Michigan. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Hai to start the presentation. Thank you.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem. So I sincerely thank Dr. Tajuddin, Dr. Mariam, and the NIIMS board to give me the opportunity to give this presentation. I had the great privilege of knowing Dr. Nagamia from 1973 when we were both residents in Boston. He was a man of vision, and he put his sweat and blood to his vision. And it is our utter responsibility to continue in his footsteps. Today, we're going to talk about the contributions of Islamic civilization to medicine with special reference to urology. Again, we're talking about 1,000 years of history, and to give it in 45 minutes is a really tough job. And Muzammil and I have been thinking as to what we can do to do the best. So what we will do is, the slide presentation is more comprehensive, but because of the time factor, we will go over the slides more quickly. It will be recorded and will be accessible at a later time too. So if you want to go into the details, you can look it up. But I think it's time that we wake up and look at history, learn from it, and move forward. So without saying much, I'm going to dive into the presentation. Why is it important to study and understand the history of the Islamic contributions? Firstly, we need to realize that the contributions to medicine started right from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. The Tib al-Nabawi was started by him, and there is evidence of all kinds to prove that. And this period continued on till the 1600s, as we will show you with the historical background. The Muslim contribution to medicine and science has been totally forgotten by the Western world, and it has been put under cover. We need to bring it out. Unfortunately, many Muslims, even physicians today, do not know the rich heritage. They feel that there was the Greco-Roman era of Hippocrates and Galen, and then the Renaissance in Europe brought medicine back. And that is not true. The 1,000 years in between was the Islamic Golden Age. It was a great example where the scholarship was shared, there was tolerance, understanding, and it was all for the betterment of humanity. Even women were an important part of this whole development. So when we look at the Golden Age, it's a fascinating period. And now that we have a lot of literature translated from Arabic and Persian and Sanskrit, we can dive more deeper into it. So after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Umayyads took it on in Damascus, and they started the translation of several medical and astronomical books at that time. The Abbasids, when they got in power in 750, Baghdad became the center of translations, and scholars like Yahya ibn al-Batriq, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, they did a lot of the translations in the initial stages. Once all the translations from Greek, Roman, Indian medicine was available, then the scholars enriched it, added their experience, and did a lot more research, and that became the basis of modern Western medicine. The era marked by the polymaths who were brilliant in everything that they took on. In the 8th century, Baghdad emerged as the center for translation and scholarship. The Abbasids were very learned, and they opened the doors for Persia, the Byzantine Empire, Italy, India, China, to bring all the knowledge together. And this globalization was started by Khalifa al-Mansur. The House of Wisdom was established by Harun al-Rashid, and his son al-Mamun generously supported it. And several polymaths, and is a short list here that I'm giving, Al-Kindi, Al-Tabari, Ibn Zakaria al-Razi, Al-Zahrawi, Ibn Sina, they all contributed in that era. Many competing centers were established in Cairo, Samarkand, Cordoba, and it kept on growing. Just to summarize the 6 major medical achievements, first was the extensive translation from all the different languages, all the different sources into Arabic and Persian, where all the scholars could understand it. Doctrines of hospitals and doctor training was laid down. The basis was established. Anatomy and of the human body and circulation, which was sometimes misrepresented in the Greco-Roman era, was clarified. The basis of infectious diseases was established. As a matter of fact, the first descriptions of septic shock was in this early era. Many surgical instruments and procedures were developed. On the pharmaceutical side, a huge list of medications, herbs, and supplements was developed, and many pharmacies were opened. This is just to show you a chronology of the scholars of the Golden Age. You can see in every era, every century, there were major contributors. And again, this is a very small list of them. The major works, the publications, the writings, which form the basis of modern medicine are mentioned here, like the Canon of Medicine by Ibn Sina, the anatomical charts, the book of the Treatise of the Eye by Ibn Haytham, Al-Tasrif by Zahrawi, and so on. But they were not only about medicine, but about medical ethics, about general public's understanding, and the whole philosophy behind illness and its treatment. Major centers of learning were developed. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, the Al-Azhar University was established in Cordoba. Healing first hospital was established in Damascus, and it was mainly treating leprosy. First hospital in Baghdad, which was called Bimaristan, which is a Persian word, was established in 800. And by the time the century took a turn, there were 30 hospitals in the Islamic world. Here is a miniature showing a Persian physician teaching his pupils as to how to treat, how to evaluate a patient in the medical school. Another miniature showing how cautery was used to stop bleeding in a patient. This is like an amphitheater showing a miniature where the surgeon in the center is treating a patient and all the pupils sitting around are observing how he is doing it. So we have enough evidence of the achievements of this golden era. This is a picture of a very famous scholar, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he is known in the Western world, who provided the theoretical framework for medicine. And Muzammil is going to continue with the next few slides on Ibn Sina and his particular work.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. What we thought we'd do to illustrate the depth of knowledge and the contributions of Islam into medicine is to do a deep dive into one small area. And since we're urologists, we picked the field of urology. So what we wanted to do is talk about Ibn Sina and the Canon of Medicine, and in particular look at the urology parts of it to show how much knowledge and information there was. So Ibn Sina himself was born in the late 10th century in Uzbekistan, and interestingly had a very broad background. He studied science of religion. He was a noted theologian. He was a noted philosopher. He was a hafiz of the Quran, and he was able to also become a master of medicine, and was probably well known for his medical works. He wrote the Canon of Medicine as a compendium of all medical knowledge at the time. He took it from multiple sources, brought it together, and here's a copy of the first page of the Canon of Medicine. In it, he starts off with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and he says, "I prepare this book on medicine, setting forth its general and particular laws to the full extent necessary, yet with apt brevity." And next slide. What we did was the first volume is available in English, but the remaining 4 volumes we combed through and translated the appropriate sections related to urology, and we'll talk about them in just a moment. The 5 volumes are very dense, over 400 pages each. The first one contained the general principles of medicine. The second volume talked about pharmacology. The third talked about local diseases, and the fourth, general disease, and finally, the last volume was regarding compounding medications. And again, it classified and categorized all medical knowledge available at the time. Next slide, please. The Canon of Medicine was such an immense contribution to the field of medicine. It was used across both the Arab and Muslim worlds, and certainly into the European continent also. It was first translated into Latin in the 12th century by Gerard of Cremona. It underwent over 30 subsequent editions, and it became a foundation of the medical school curriculum in most European schools starting in the 13th century. They had class and lectures specifically on the canon. So much so that after several centuries of it being there, and rightly so, the canon was criticized. Of course, when you have a compendium of knowledge and it hasn't changed in a few centuries, it's expected that people are going to move on. But it's interestingly, in the 16th century, one of the critics of the canon wrote a paper entitled "The Short Works of the New Florentine Academy and Against the Physicians Who, Neglecting Galen, Cultivate the Barbarians." So we see that not only were attacks against the canon after a few centuries based not just on the scientific contributions of the canon, which probably by the 16th, 17th century were outdated, but there's also the attacks were based on the fact that Ibn Sina was a barbarian and came from the barbarian continents, and so this disdain for things from the Arab and Muslim continents and civilizations is something that we unfortunately see repeatedly, and this is one of the reasons why institutions like NIIMS is so important. The last mention of the canon as part of the curriculum in European medical school was in the late 18th century in Padua. Next slide, please. This is a picture of one of the beautiful pages of the canon, just really artistically done, a lot of wonderful illustrations. This is from the Vatican Library, and this is one of the Latin editions of the Canon of Medicine done in the 14th century. So it's specifically regarding urology, Volume 1 had a very prominent chapter on urine. Urine was studied extensively by a lot of the physicians at the time as an easy way to tell if there's a medical problem and how to guide treatment. Volume 3 dealt with the kidney and bladder pathology. And in volumes 2 and 5, there's multiple medications that they had suggested on treatment of urological conditions. Next slide, please. The most popular urology-related section, certainly, though, is urine. And we see in the subsections that we translated, we see that there's a number of discussions on urine, how to collect it, the significance of color, how to measure the density of the urine, that's a specific gravity, what the odor, the foam, and other contents of the urine can tell you about someone's health and their prognosis. And it even had variations of age, variations on gender, and how to tell animal urine and fake urine apart from human urine. The chapters on the kidney talked about the anatomy of the kidney, the various ailments of the kidney, whether inflammation, kidney stones, hematuria, and some of the medications and suggested treatments on preventing stones and treating some of these ailments. These sections were listed on that slide if you want to take a look at them at some point. Specifically in the chapter on the kidneys, Ibn Sina had written, if the kidney is weakened, it cannot perform the cleaning duty and the urine will be abnormal. And certainly this shows an understanding that the kidney's function was to clean the blood and keep the body healthy. And certainly these sections were used extensively. Volume 3 was used up until the early 17th century in Padua. Next slide, please. On the sections of the bladder, we see a similar thorough breakdown on diseases of the bladder, the anatomy of the bladder, how the bladder works, talking about bladder stones, how to empty the bladder, just an extensive series of observations and treatments and exploration of how the bladder is working and how to treat the problems that are related to the bladder. The whole list is of the sections are on this slide, and hopefully you can review it at your convenience. Next slide, please. In regarding emptying of the bladder, something that as urologists we're always concerned about, Ibn Sina wrote that the best catheters are those that are from a soft material. He suggested using the skins of fish and animals and using lubrication with melted or soft cheese to allow the catheter to pass. He advised that as you pass a catheter, the physician should be careful that you do not rip the lining of the urethra. As you pass it, you must proceed with slowly and carefully. And certainly these are suggestions that even now we would advise our nurses and and healthcare providers to follow. There was an exploration of the voiding reflex. So avoiding reflex, where there was an understanding that there's a sphincter that needs to relax and the bladder needs to squeeze down to allow the bladder to empty, and a discussion of aseptic technique in the genitalia, where leeches and other suggestions were made to keep that area clean and avoid inflammation or infection. Next slide, please. So the Canon of Medicine was important because it organized our knowledge of medicine at that time. It was very practical and holistic. Again, it emphasized brevity and allowed people to quickly understand different ailments, and was a great learning tool for healthcare providers of all types for many, many centuries. It was more importantly, it reintroduced Hippocratic and Galenic medicine back to Europe after it had been processed and translated by the Arab and Muslim civilizations. Next slide, please. I will let Dr. Hai move on, but two things of note. When it came to urology, and I think this is general for all of this study of our history, is that the rich legacy of Arab and Muslim medicine and Indian medicine sets a very high bar for us physicians here today in the United States. It's a very high bar for us to strive for. And in particular, the multidisciplinary approach, where these physicians were also humanitarians. They studied ethics, theology. These are all things that I hope that we can all strive for and continue to improve upon. So Dr. Hai, you can take it from there.
Kind of go over some of the basic contributions that they made. So Al-Baghdadi did a lot of dissections and came to the basic anatomy of the urinary system. And he wrote the book Al-Mukhtar fi al-Tib. So, and he felt that unless you know the anatomy, you cannot be a good surgeon. And this fact was confirmed by Al-Razi, Zahrawi, and all the others who did surgery. There was work also on congenital anomalies, and Al-Majusi was the first one to correctly describe the conditions of hypospadias and hermaphroditism. The urine sample, the Muslim physicians felt, was a very important source of knowledge for the medicine. And that's why they examined the urine very thoroughly, looking at the physical and chemical characteristics of it. And a lot of times they could diagnose the disease primarily by just doing a urinalysis. And Al-Razi stated that the urinary system is a good representation of what's going on with the whole body. And that is very true even today. The Canon of Medicine, as Muzammil described, went into great details of even how to collect the sample and how to analyze it in detail. Urinary stones were very common in that era, and great time and effort was spent to find out what causes stones in the urinary system. There were experimental ways of producing stones, analyzing them for their chemical nature, and then trying different herbs and medications to how to not only treat the problem, but also how to prevent it. And Al-Razi advised specific sedatives even when the patient was having an acute renal colic, and later how herbs can be used to prevent and dissolve stones. The list of herbs and vegetables that were used by them is a very long list, but even some of those ingredients are used today in our pharmaceutical usage. Al-Razi and Zahrawi were the main people who dealt with the surgical management of stones. And Al-Razi wrote a book with 10th volumes of his 23-volume treatise talks primarily about how to break larger stones. Al-Zahrawi not only developed a lot of these instruments, but specifically for fragmenting the stone, irrigating the pieces of stone out, and he also developed different techniques, even in women who had bladder stone, to approach the stone transvaginally, and was very successful. I'll show you some of the instruments, and I'm really thankful to my wife Annette for doing these for me, looking at the original specimen and making these diagrams from them. So you can see these are two stone forceps which he used to grasp the stone and pull them out. Here we can show that the basic idea that he had, you see on the right hand side, these were the instruments of Al-Abu Qasis compared to modern 18th century instruments. So there was not much change. The principles were the same, just the shape and design changed, but the basis was from Al-Zahrawi's work. Here is a knife that Al-Zahrawi specifically developed to make an incision in the perineum and approach the bladder through that route to get to the stone in the bladder. Here is what he called a mishhab, which is a drill which was used to break impacted stones, like in the urethra, and it would break the stone into smaller pieces, and then it could be irrigated or washed out. Here is another instrument used by Al-Zahrawi. So not only that he developed these instruments, but also specifically detailed methodology of how these should be used appropriately. And there is a bladder irrigating syringe. Basically, we are still using the same principles as shown in these diagrams. He developed specific instruments. This is what he called a methkhab, and it's a perforator which fragments impacted urethral stones. Here is a very fine scalpel that he developed just to open up the opening of the urethra, the meatus, which was a very common procedure in that era. These are other knives that he developed. And we are very fortunate that some replicas of those instruments are here in the NIIMS museum here. So if you ever visit NIIMS Museum in Chicago, you'll actually be able to see replicas of it. The originals are in the Topkapi Museum in Istanbul and in Cordoba. So these have been well preserved, and we can look back as to the great wisdom of these polymaths of that era. This is a very commonly used instrument. It was used to perform circumcision in those days. And our scissors today are just a modification of what Al-Zahrawi had recommended at that time. This was an instrument Al-Zahrawi developed to stop bleeding, which we call cauterization. And now we use electric cauterization, but at that time it was heat which was used to stop the bleeding. The principles remain the same. The instruments have improved as we got into electricity in the later eras. The development of catheters, as Muzammil had mentioned, was started with Ibn Sina, but every year, every century, there were marked improvements. And in the 9th century, there were catheters and dilators made of gold, silver, copper, and then they were made more malleable. So they would take the shape of the urethra, so it would be easy to insert it. There were based on al-Baghdadi's anatomical dissections, they could copy the urethral curve to make the instrument to be more effective. And up till the 19th century, these catheters were used. And even when I started practice, there were some of these old catheters still in storage. Till in the 19th century, the new rubber Foley catheters came out, and they are even currently in use. This is a picture of some of the original instruments developed by Al-Zahrawi. It's preserved in the museum. But you can see that the fineness of these instruments and the great definition that he put into each instrument that he developed. This was an interesting talisman which was used in those eras for treatment. So in the circle, you can see the disease condition or the symptom, and based on that, they could figure out what would be the next steps to take. And again, everything started with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So faith was a very important part of this golden age of Islamic civilization. This is a copy of a page from Al-Tasrif, Zahrawi's book, and you can see the instruments that he developed and the details of how to use the instrument correctly were specifically mentioned. And as you see, it's all in Arabic, and they were later translated into Latin and French and were used in the medieval period and later in the modern Europe. So this was a translation of Al-Tasrif in English as early as 1986. So this was his advice presentation to would-be authors on medicine, how even to write the book and what to mention. So this is another page from Ibn al-Baytar's book and treatise in medicine. So the good news is all these are now available, and we have been able to translate them, and even in Wikipedia and other sources you can get an enormous amount of information. So as we go forward, we can look further back in history and get the originals available. And this development of urology has continued. And even in our contemporary world of urology, I just mentioned some of the original works which are being done. Dr. Rabi Abdul Halim in the Middle East has done a lot of Arabic, Persian, and Latin translation into English, which is all available now. Dr. Emil Tanago, who was in California, was of Arabic origin too, and he did a lot of original work on micturition. Dr. Ghanim did the first few case surgeries of urinary diversion, which has now become a routine stuff in this country. Robotic surgery was well advanced by two well-known urologists who are currently in practice, Dr. Jihad Kaouk and Dr. Rani Abaza, in renal transplantation. The first renal transplantation was done in this country, in the USA, by a Muslim surgeon, Salah Al-Askari, in New York. And Dr. Askari, I had the privilege of meeting him in his very old age, was not only a great surgeon, but a great humanitarian. He would do all these surgeries free of charge in New York, and would find people to support his work. So this is the type of impetus we need. Dr. Adibul Hassan Rizvi, I was present in Karachi when he did his first renal transplantation and brought this whole technology to our current status in Pakistan. Dr. Raza Malik, Dr. Mustafa Al-Hilali, these are absolute giants in the field of urology even today. Dr. Muzammil and I developed a laser for prostate surgery. So, this has to continue. The legacy we have is very strong, and it is upon us how we take it and take on this job and go further in advancement. There are many publications. As a matter of fact, UNESCO published a 6-volume series, The Different Aspects of Islamic Culture. And volume 4, part 2, is devoted to technology and applied sciences and medicine. So the resources are all there. So in conclusion, the history and achievements of the Islamic Golden Age started with the Prophet ﷺ and continued for over 1,000 years. The Western world has failed to give it due reference. It is now our duty to bring it to the front and continue the great work, the foundations which were laid by these scholars. The actual foundation of modern medicine was laid during this golden age, and we have ample proof for it. What was most amazing is that this period was a period of scholarship. There was Jews and Christians and Muslims all working in cooperation and sharing the knowledge. Another good factor was it was supported by the caliphs, by the ruling class, and both men and women were in leading roles. All these advancements in medicine and science was purely for one cause, and that was for the betterment of humanity. Faith had a very strong part to do, because as the Khalifa of human race, it was their responsibility to make sure that human suffering was brought to the least. And I will end this talk with a beautiful prayer by Allama Iqbal, where he is praying to Allah that may God give us the same sense of discovery and research in our lives. Zamire lalame roshan chirage arzu kar de, chaman ke zarre zarre ko shahide justaju kar de. Thank you for your time and listening. We will open up the question and answer session, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahmood, Dr. Muzammil. That was incredible. I'm internal medicine, so not surgery, but I learned so much just from what you're saying. And I think it's incredible that, mashallah, the museum that we have has these instruments, like you mentioned. So we've had, just to remind everyone that this is our Q&A session right now. So please feel free to ask any questions, whether you're on Facebook, YouTube. So please, we're happy to answer any questions. Just as a reminder as well, too, that we are going to be having these recurrent webinar series. So exactly like Dr. Muzammil mentioned, that, this is just a highlight on urology. Inshallah, we'll be focusing on a lot of other areas. So please stay tuned for that. And these webinars are being headed up by our own board member, Dr. Shahabuddin, as well. So some questions that have come in, and thankfully you guys have addressed this as well, too. But again, just to reinforce the points as well, too, that in your opinion, at what time in history has research and development by Muslims, did it stop, would you say, and why? And if it hasn't stopped, why is it that we don't know about all of these things, and why do we need something like NIIMS? Dr. Mahmood, if you want to start.
Yeah. So I think once we got into the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the conquests of Muslim conquerors, like in India and further in Turkey, we got too lost in the dunya. We were about materials, about gaining power, authority, and what in Urdu we call ayyashi, means lost in the pleasures of this world. And we forgot about the knowledge which Allah has given us, and that's where our downfall started. And unfortunately, today we look around the world, and a lot of the Muslim countries are the poorest in knowledge. And it is, God has provided us this opportunity in the USA to rekindle this fire. And we should be the leaders and take this leadership on to all the other Muslim nations. And, the first ayah of the Quran talks about ilm and knowledge and speed. So we need to go back to our heritage.
Yeah, just to expound on that, in order to have research and really push the frontiers of medicine, you need a stable civilization, a stable society. You need benefactors and grants. And unfortunately, many of those things dwindled, particularly as Islamic civilization became the subject of colonial growth and attacks, and there's just in knowledge in general, there's a discussion of the closing of the doors of ijtihad, where not just medical knowledge, but just other knowledge was thought to not be as useful, and people were not encouraged to think and philosophize, and that certainly had a very negative impact on medical research also. But as Dr. Hai pointed out in his presentation, we see a major resurgence of Muslim physicians and researchers contributing to pushing the frontiers of medicine forward. As we know, even the current mRNA vaccine was developed by a Muslim couple in Europe, and so I think that it's nothing intrinsic to Muslim society that has prevented research. It's just been the political and economic factors that have really prevented the Muslim world from contributing as much to medicine over the last century. But again, I think that is changing, and one of these, the NIIMS series that you have is a great inspiration for all young physicians and older physicians like ourselves to really start to look to see how we can contribute to advancing medicine and alleviating human suffering.
As a matter of fact, when I came in 1973, if you looked at a scientific paper, you would not find Muslim names. And now if you pick up any journal, any literary and medical literature, there are Muslim names in it. So I think it's a very promising era, but we need to continue promoting it.
Those are really good points. Thank you so much for explaining that so clearly. We did get a question, and I might have to editorialize this just a little bit, but saying that I've been having pain in the lower left side of my abdomen, been there for years. Medication is helping. Any suggestions? So one thing I just want to say is that, alhamdulillah, these are education talks, right? And we're talking about history as well. And so this is not meant to be medical advice, and, nothing that we want to hand out medical advice right now. Our usual recommendations are please visit a doctor if you're having any issues, whether that hopefully a primary care physician, or if it's some issue that's more urgent, please visit a local emergency room or urgent care. But I mean, I don't know if there's any, I'm sure you guys get these questions all the time as well too. But so one thing that has come up for me as well too. So you had mentioned women, Dr. Hai, that alhamdulillah, they've been a part of a lot of our history as well too. But unfortunately, our history doesn't always talk about them. And now, whether that, obviously there's a lot of intricacies behind that as well too, but especially a field like urology, where you will have issues like incontinence, or, obviously where the pure anatomy of it, it's a very stigmatized area sometimes, especially for women. And so I guess the thing that I wanted to ask you guys is just that how do you, or how would you say that people should reconcile the need to advance knowledge or the need to gain knowledge with a very important and cultural reality of Hayya, right? And Sharam and all of that. And so just to see if that's, I'm sure that's come up with you guys before as well too, with female patients and their male partners as well too.
Yeah, so I'll start with a little historical incidents though. If you remember, when we read Western literature, it says Florence Nightingale was the first one who started nursing. Look back at the Badr, and the Prophet ﷺ selected certain women, and we have the names of those women, and sent them, you go in the battlefield and take care of the injured people. So that's where nursing started, with the Prophet ﷺ. So unfortunately, history has been written by males. And I have always a very strong conflict of interest. And they totally ignored the contributions of the women, and which is very wrong. And even, when you read the tafasir of the Quran, the Quran tafasir written by the men were very biased for the men. And most of the tafasir were written like that. So I think we need to change that. And it is our responsibility to dig the names of those women who contributed to it and bring them up. They are more than 50% of our intelligentsia. Let's bring them into science, into daily living, and highlight them, what they're doing.
Yeah. And interestingly, our practice is based partly in the city of Dearborn in Michigan, which has one of the highest concentrations of Arabs and Muslims in the United States. And so we have a lot of Muslim patients that are women who come in with infections and incontinence. And for the most part, certainly when there's no other option, they allow us to treat them and examine them. But one thing that's really reassuring and really a great development in medicine, as you know, when you look at the young graduates that are graduating from medical school classes, I think over 50% of medical school graduates are women. And so medicine is a field that is attracting a lot of women, and some of them are going into urology. So I hope that in all of these fields we'll have women there and just people of all backgrounds, because I think when you treat patients, having that connection, whether it's the same ethnicity, the same language, the same gender, that builds a certain amount of confidence and trust, so that your treatment plans will be more effective. You'll have better compliance. So I think that there's some empiric good reason for the healthcare provider to look like the recipient of the healthcare, and certainly this is a trend, at least in the United States, that I see has been positive. But let's see how things develop. Inshallah, it'll be for the better.
Inshallah, definitely. To bring some of the questions back to you guys personally, you had mentioned, right, Dr. Hyde, that unfortunately our Western world doesn't always acknowledge the contributions that the Muslim and Arab world had. So at what point did you guys intersect with our history and have that knowledge of how much contributions Muslims and Arabs had? Was it during medical school? Was it later on after that?
Yeah, unfortunately, when I went to medical school in India, they totally ignored it. And we were talked about Hippocrates and Galen, and then they came into the modern medicine in Europe. It was totally mistaken. I mean, even Ibn Sina's name was not mentioned, unfortunately. So then when we started reading literature and some of the translations started happening, that was awakened me about 20 years back. And the more I have looked, the more in depth I found. And as a matter of fact, Muzammil gave that presentation to American Urology Association, what, about 15 years back? Yeah, on Ibn Sina. And they were totally amazed. I mean, to a point that when I was doing the green light laser work, I was training urologists in my center to how to use it. And a Jewish doctor came. He was a professor of urology from New York, and he came and he said, "Dr. Hai, your name sounds Muslim, but I don't know of any Muslim who has contributed much to medicine." And I said, "Brother, it's starting." So wake up. And there are a lot of Muslims now in this field, and we will be a part of the scientific world.
Yeah. Interestingly, oh, go ahead.
No, I had one comment about Dr. Askari. Dr. Askari should also be recognized as one of the founders of Imana. Yeah. And all our initial meetings used to take place in his house in New York City. I was there between 1967 through 71, and all the meetings of Imana were at Dr. Askari's house. a great urologist. I'm so happy to hear his name again. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
A great humanitarian.
Yes.
I think part of the onus of bringing up our historical legacy is really upon us. You know, my first exposure to Ibn Sina was in philosophy classes, and had really very little idea that he was such a, and this is as an undergraduate student, they had no idea that he was such a talented physician also, and that only came up later. Even our own, even people from our own background who are from from Asia or Africa are not even aware of our own history. One fantastic book that if hopefully many of us get a chance to read is called The Emperor of All Maladies by Dr. Mukherjee. He won the Pulitzer Prize, and it's a history of cancer. And even though he himself is from the subcontinent, totally glosses over, as he's talking about the history of cancer, any contribution of whether from the subcontinent in Asia or Africa to understanding cancer and understanding medicine. So this is a problem that I think we have. We certainly can't expect people who are not from a Asian or Arabic or Muslim background to dig up. This is stuff that we have to do ourselves. And I encourage people, young residents in any specialty, just take some time, do some historical research. It's very easy to do. You have access to most of the texts, and I think just as we had done with urology, I think you'll find that there's many other wonderful contributions that really form the foundation of medicine as we practice it today.
Yeah. I have one comment about Muzammil, when you pointed out that we need stable society and institutional support and institutional creation by Muslims. One sad example was Dr. Kardan, who is one of our board members from Aleppo, Syria. And he was not only an orthopedic surgeon, but also the head of the Department of Islamic Studies, Islamic Medicine. He's a living giant at the moment. He's in, when he was displaced by the Syrian unrest, he wanted us to sponsor him. We did not have an institution for Muslims, by Muslims in this country to sponsor him. So he ended up getting two offers, one from a Jewish institution in New York, and the other one is in Utah. That's where he is right now. So we need, I'm glad that you really pointed out, Dr. Muzammil, because this is very, very important. We are through with building mosques. I think we should build institutions. Mm-hmm. So unfortunate, our society doesn't even think that it is sawab to contribute to institutions like ours. Right now, where he's sitting, Northwest Suburban College, we were approved for a DO school. It required $80 to $100 million. That was the dream of IIIM, but we couldn't hack it. We had to let it go. And as you all know, the DO schools have mushroomed from 4 to 40 now. Majority of them are, of course, there's nothing wrong with them, are Jewish controlled and owned. So I think it's a wake-up call for Muslims to work for institutions. That's my plug. Thank you for listening.
I mean, building a hospital is a sadqa jariyah. Every human being who is treated and relieved of pain and stress will pray for humanity. So, I mean, that is the best investment. And I think we are at that point now that we should start building institutions. We have built enough masajids, enough community centers. That should be the focus of this decade, inshallah.
I think that's great.
As to Muslim women are being ignored, I think it's not going to happen again. Not only Maryam is a secretary of IIIM, but the president of IMANA. So this is a welcome addition, and she's taken up that task to help everybody else out, women contribution to medicine. That's one of her projects.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, alhamdulillah. And actually, we have right at the hour mark right now. And I was just enjoying listening to this conversation, mashallah. And so I think just one quick thing to let people know too is that, one of Dr. Nagamia's dreams was this compendium, right, of all these contributions of physicians, scientists, to the field of medicine. And a part of that is, women's history as well too. And so our friends across the pond with the British Islamic Medical Association have contributed a lot too to trying to increase that field or awareness, at least of what women's contributions are. But exactly like everything you guys have said, that the work is just starting, and it has started, and we just need to continue it and just let the world know and remind ourselves of who we are and the great identity we have, and to be very proud of it, and to help spread that to other people, inshallah. So I just want to thank Dr. Ahmed so much for, it was extremely wonderful talk and just very enlightening, and appreciate your guys' time. Thank you to Dr. Tajuddin Ahmed for taking the helm of NIIMS, especially after this tragedy that we have, and doing it with such passion and dedication and grace with it. So thank you for that, Uncle. And I want to thank Alia, our executive director. She's always behind the scenes, but making everything run and making everything smooth and making us look good, alhamdulillah. Thanks to Dr. Shahabuddin as well for setting up these webinars, and look out for more webinars again in the future. And so I just want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the conversation. And inshallah, we'll see you at the next webinar then.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.